All right, so I don't know if I warned you about this or not, but I kind of really felt like I wanted to spend some time between the Testaments. We've been doing, remember I said from day one back whenever we started this thing, that we were going to look at God's story, and I'm convinced that part of the story is during what this is called the silent years. Okay? There's 400 years between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And frankly, I had to do a bunch of research because it's been too long ago since I've had any classes in some of this. But it was very fascinating to me, and I don't want to scare you with a lot of history or anything. I want you to have an open mind to see what God was doing in those 400 years, okay? And so, so just a couple things. And if you don't have a pen, I want to encourage you to. If you don't have to take notes, you won't offend me. But my study Bible calls this time period the interlude. Okay, that's one thing that people refer to it as. And I found it fascinating. Somebody wrote this: there was no prophets, just silence. All right? And so this is the time, if you look at the top there, this is the time from Malachi to Christ. Or actually, I would say it's Malachi from about 400 BC to John the Baptist. All right? So we started at the beginning, and I thought we'd fill in this middle before we jump into the Gospels. All right? So from Malachi, about 400 BC, to John the Baptist, which was about AD 25. We're going to talk about dating and the New Testament, things like that in a minute. Okay. Now, if you like the history, I'm not going to go through it all, but I just want to hit the highlights on the left side. Okay, so what we're looking at is a time. You'll see Malachi at the top there, and about AD 30 at the bottom in this middle graph. Okay, that's the years. First of all, it was the Persian period. We started into that, if you'll recall, in the Minor Prophets. Remember, there's a section, the last couple of books of the Minor Prophets, there's 3 or 4 of them, that actually deal with the return back to Jerusalem during the Persian period. Okay, so that gives you a hint. That's why this kind of stuff is at least important, if not also fun, to look at and give time. This is when Malachi was writing, things like that, okay? And so you can see there, it was in that section, the Persian period, it was ruled by the high priest. The high priests were it. They were the government, they were the religious leaders, they were everything, okay? And so they ran the show. And you get that sense. I just lost my prophet's name from the Minor Prophets. Okay. But you get that as you look at the Minor Prophets, all right? And their importance there to the society, to the Israelites going back to their promised land, all right? Then onto the scene comes comes Alexander the Great. Okay, so you have a time frame. As you've studied him in history, you've probably heard his name, if nothing else. And that was an important time period in history. But you can look across the right there. Before we go on, I want to give you another piece that's not on there. But during this 400-year period, several prophecies were fulfilled. Okay? Now, I didn't dig into all of them, but for example, from Daniel, if you want to write this down, look it up later, Daniel 8:14, it talks about 2,300 days of desecration. Okay? It's a quiet period. Somebody want to do the math on how many years that is?
Daniel what?
2,300 days
8:14.
of desecration. That's what? I'm sorry?
No, he was asking what chapter.
Oh, I'm sorry. Daniel 8:14. Yes. Thank you. Okay. Now, the sad thing about this is they have this 400 years to get ready for the Messiah, and as I was studying this, many scholars consider the time wasted. There was so much infighting. Israel wasn't ready for the humble Messiah that was about to come. Okay, they could have been prepared. Had they been studying Scripture and actually been looking at it in more detail, they would have realized that they had great misconception about who the Messiah was to be. But this is all part of God's plan too, so we understand that. But they had not studied Scripture. And if you want to write this down, I'm gonna give it to you again. A great resource place is gotquestions.org. Okay, and I have researched these people and this thing that's there. It's very reliable. Occasionally it'll have a little bent towards the forum side, but it's very, very good site to ask questions and to get some biblical answers. Okay? So I encourage you to check that out. Got Questions, G-O-T, questions.org. Okay? Very good group of folks that want to present biblical answers. They try not to be too theological one side or another. All right. So that's okay. Now we're back to the left side with the Hellenistic period, and you see the dates there. Again, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but at the very end of that section, the Greek conquest prepared the way for the translation of the Old Testament into Greek. Septuagint version at 250 BC. Okay. Because most people, when the Greeks came in, the language of the people was Greek, okay? And so by now, what was happening was most people spoke Greek. And what happened was they took the Old Testament from Hebrew and translated into the Greek language. That's what's called the Septuagint, if you've ever heard that version, or that word before, okay? Many times, if you have a study Bible and you're reading your New Testament, and it's quoting something from the Old Testament, quite often in your study Bible, it might say, this is from the Septuagint. A lot of the writers in the New Testament would actually use translations from the Septuagint and not all the way to the Greek. Really? I wouldn't have called anybody else out on that, but I just had to because it was that. I love it, Joe. All right. Did you say that? I don't think that's PC. Turn that thing off. All right. So again, we see in this story that we're telling from Genesis 1 till the end of Revelation, we see even here, you're going to see, I'm going to give you a verse at the very end of this, but we see God working in an amazing way. And this language now is just permeating the world, and we get the Septuagint, on and on. Okay, so that's just part of it. All right. If you have something you want to add about a particular period or whatever, otherwise I'll stop and come back, if I forget, just throw something at me. All right, the next time period is the Hasmonean period. You can maybe know this better as the Maccabees period, okay? The Maccabean period, all right? That's who was kind of taken off at this point. They're on here somewhere, right? Oh, at the bottom of this section, it talks about Judas the Maccabean, okay? Let me tell you what was going on here. Because I kind of lost track of this. I knew about the Maccabees, and there's also some I'm sorry, that's one of my red notes I forgot to tell you. It's also called the intertestamental period, all right? Intertestamental period between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And there are books of the Bible, which are not canon, not put into the Bible, that are called intertestamental books, okay? One of those would be the book, I don't remember how many there are, there's a couple of them, I think at least, Maccabees, okay? And that's some of these stories and stuff. Makes for good reading. It's was not considered by the early church as canon, inspired by God, okay? So, I have family members that read this stuff and quote me, and I'm like, okay, whatever, just don't build your world around that, all right? Okay? Jews were being greatly oppressed, and so they step up and they revolt. But here's what I was reminded of as I was doing this research. There was much infighting. Surprise, surprise. And the Sadducees, now remember, they had kings and they had priests. They were supposed to all be one, but the Sadducees kind of felt like anybody could be both kings or priests. They wanted a split. They wanted it, just anybody that we pick should be allowed to. Whereas the Pharisees, as we see during Jesus' time shortly, were much more dogmatic. Only those who had David's line, remember he is the king, and he's going to be the lineage to the Messiah. So the Pharisees said, no, we got to stick with the lineage of David, and they're keeping track. They're keeping score at home. They got their books and documents, and you got to prove who you are, okay? and they also said the priests had their, why am I forgetting my minor prophets? Somebody, the priest who brought the guys back. Help me out. Ezra, thank you, Ezra the priest. In that book, there's a list of people. We don't have documents for you. You can't serve as priest until we find out whether or not you're legit or not. They were that dogmatic, and rightfully so, okay? So the Pharisees wanted to stay that way. The Sadducees not so much. And during this period of time, roughly how long? 100 years, all of this infighting to actually get control, but they're fighting amongst themselves. And they're not really doing anything good in that way. But they wanted to have Aaron's lineage, the Pharisees did. So, along comes the Romans. And they decide they're going to take over everybody. And Pompey comes out and kicks their butt and takes over. Okay? And they offered very little resistance because, again, they're too busy fighting amongst themselves. That's the short version of the story. Okay? You can read more of that yourself. But that's what we're seeing here in this period. And you've probably read or heard some about that. There's been movies done about it. Okay? So then lastly, the Roman period, 63 BC on. Just a couple things I want to highlight about that. I'm sorry. During the Hasmonean period, copies of the scriptures were ordered destroyed and laws were enforced with extreme cruelty. The oppressed Jews revolted, led by, okay, we read it. All right, I told you. Okay, next period was the Roman period, 63 BC. Pompey came in. Remember I said the Jews were too busy fighting with themselves. They didn't put up much of a defense. They became subject to Rome. Herod the Great was ruler. Remember, these were puppet governments. Ultimately, all these governors, kings, whatever, had to answer to Rome. Okay? So that's when we see the end of this intertestamental period. And you had a great question, Rebecca, because now we're getting into the Messiah is coming. But we had a long ways. We had 400 years to get there. Okay? Here's the verse I wanted to share with you at the end of this because I thought it was really, really appropriate. It's a great verse from Galatians 4:4. Galatians 4:4. And Paul wrote, but when the right time came, God sent his son. Okay? The Romans came in, took over the world, got everybody speaking pretty much the same language. Roads were set up, and the Messiah came.